Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and thank you so much for tuning in tonight. We're very excited to welcome former U.S. Ambassador Michael McFaul and historian and journalist Max Boot for what promises to be a great discussion about foreign policy. I welcome you to tonight's America at a Crossroads program on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and community advocates, and on behalf of our leadership team that works really hard to make these programs come about. Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lehrer, and myself. We've added some really exciting new programs which we'd like to call to your attention. On April 21st, we present a program entitled Can American Elections Be Fixed? What will it take to strengthen our United States democracy? Our guests will be two of the country's foremost election experts, Professor of Political Sociology at Stanford, Larry Diamond, and UC Irvine election law expert, Rick Hansen, who's been with us previously, and I know that you'll really want to join for that program. We are also very excited that Congressman Adam Kinzinger from Rockford, Illinois, will be our guest in April. We should have that date determined within the next few days, so keep an eye out for it. As you are all undoubtedly aware, he is one of the few Republicans who voted in favor of Trump's impeachment, and one of those whom Trump mentioned in his speech at the Orlando CPAC conference last weekend. Kinzinger was amongst those whom Trump threatened to get rid of, in quotes. Stay tuned for the date. Thank you to our many wonderful co-sponsors, Temple Isaiah, Stephen Wise Temple, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Beth Am, Leo Beck Temple, IKAR, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Jewish Center for Justice, the Holocaust Museum LA, Pico Union Project, AJC Los Angeles, Shirat Hayam, a pluralistic Jewish congregation in Nantucket, and our newest co-sponsor this week, the ADL. We hope that many of you have succeeded in getting your COVID shots. There is light at the end of this tunnel, but we need to continue wearing our masks, continue good social distance practices, and continue to be grateful for Zoom. Now, to tell you about a couple of other new programs we've just added in March and April, please welcome my colleague, the terrific David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice. On behalf of community advocates and our board, I also welcome you this evening. A quick update on whom we have secured for the coming weeks. Next week, we will have a program that complements last week's very successful panel on extremist groups. It just approaches the problem from a different perspective. Entitled Combating Domestic Violent Extremists, Why It Will Be Harder Than Homegrown Jihadists. It'll feature the RAND Corporation's terrorism experts and one of the patriarchs of terrorism studies, Brian Jenkins, together with Javed Ali, formerly on the National Security Council's counterterrorism desk. They'll be interviewed by KPC's always terrific Larry Mantle. On March 31st, the program we just secured today will feature another RAND Corporation expert, Jennifer Kavanaugh, the author of several studies and prescriptions on the issue of truth decay, a phenomenon that we see all around us, the diminishing role of facts, data, and the blurring of the line between opinion and fact in political and civil discourse. She'll be joined by the Washington Post's prolific op-ed columnist and a colleague of our guest speaker tonight, our moderator tonight, Max Boot, our frequent guest, Jennifer Rubin. Truth decay is a matter of profound concern with serious implications for the functioning of our democracy. We'll discuss the problem and possible responses. We hope you'll continue to join us each week at this time, 5 p.m. Pacific. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to my colleague on the Jews United for Democracy and Justice Board, an old friend, an LA treasure, and one of the keys to this series' success, Zev Yaroslavsky. Zev?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Janice, for your leadership in all of this. I'm honored to present our guest speaker tonight and our interlocutor. First, our speaker, Michael McFaul, who is a preeminent international affairs analyst with an emphasis on American foreign policy as it relates to Russia and China. He served as senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council under President Obama, and then as the United States ambassador to Russia, where he served with distinction and got the attention of our friend, Mr. Putin. He is currently a director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, where for the past 25 years, he has been a professor of international studies in the Department of Political Science. He also serves as the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Dr. McFaul also is an international affairs analyst for NBC News and a columnist for the Washington Post. He has authored several outstanding and critically acclaimed books. His most recent, From Cold War to Hot Peace, An American Ambassador in Putin's Russia, was a New York Times bestseller. Dr. McFaul is a Montanan, received his BA in International Relations in Slavic Languages and his MA in Soviet and East European Studies from Stanford. As a Rhodes Scholar, he completed his PhD in International Relations at Oxford University. He spoke to our audience pre-COVID at Valley Beth Shalom in November of 2019, and we are thrilled to welcome him back to what is now a Virtual America at a Crossroads series. And I just would add on a personal note, Mike and I traipsed through Moscow together under the auspices of the National Democratic Institute in 1991. And he knew the landscape in Moscow better than I know it in Los Angeles. It was a real honor to know him then and of course now. Thanks, Mike, for agreeing to do this. In conversation with Dr. McFaul is someone who is also no stranger to this series, Max Boot. Max is a historian, best-selling author, columnist, and foreign policy analyst who has been described by the International Institute for Strategic Studies as one of the world's leading authorities on armed conflict. He is the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, a columnist for the Washington Post, and a global affairs analyst for CNN. Max has served as senior foreign policy advisor to John McCain, Mitt Romney, and Marco Rubio. He was born in Moscow and has received many awards. Among them, he was named one of America's great immigrants by the Carnegie Corporation, and he won the Eric Brindell Award for Excellence in Opinion Journalism, given annually to a writer who exhibits love of country and its democratic institutions and bears witness to the evils of totalitarianism. Max received his BA from UC Berkeley and his MA in history from Yale University. It's a pleasure to now turn the program over to Max and Mike McFaul.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be back with everybody. This is a great series. I'm glad it's continuing, and I'm glad that we can try to bridge some of the partisan divides in America by having a Stanford guy like Mike in conversation with a Cal grad like me. If we can do that, then anything is possible in Washington. We have an incredibly important subject to discuss here about repairing the damage from the Trump foreign policy. But let me just begin before we talk about the repairing. Let me just ask you, Mike, about the damage. What is the extent, in your judgment, of the damage? I mean, is this something that can be repaired in a year or two? Is this going to be a generational issue? And is everything that is a Trump legacy, is it all damage, or is there some positive stuff that comes out of as a legacy from the Trump administration that has been bequeathed to President Biden?
Well, Max, before I answer your question, let me just say thank you for having me again. Last time I was with you all, I was selling books. I signed a lot of books that day, and looking at the almost 3,000 people that are with us, I wish I was selling a book tonight, but I will be in the future. Next year, hopefully I'll have a new book out and I can come down and do so in person.
Go on Amazon right now and you can buy Mike's book and buy mine while you're at it. So maybe we can sell.
That's exactly right. In all honesty, you can do that right now. Keep listening, but you can also buy books, and they come very quickly these days. I've bought all the books you see behind me, in fact, are books I've bought in the COVID era, because I buy a lot of books. I can't say I've read them all. But Janice and David, thank you for having me again. And Zev, I don't see you anymore, but I just want to say, Zev and I had a fantastic time in the Soviet Union. I want to remind people, we were still there during the Soviet Union. Zev, in many ways, those were some of the most exciting days of my life. I want to tell you honestly. For those of you who don't remember, that was at the end of the Soviet Union. There was a moment of hope that there was going to be a transition to democracy and to the end of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev was still the president, but there was new democratic movements from throughout the country. And we were there with the National Democratic Institute, engaging with small d Democrats in a very hopeful time. Obviously it didn't work out, and that's what my book is about. Like, why did it not work out? But Zev, those were some of the most exciting times, with the possibility not only that the Cold War was ending, but that there could be democratic movements in Russia. And maybe we'll get around to this later, Max. I'm still hopeful. I got to, the horizon has to be longer, but I'm still hopeful about that. Zev, actually, just so you all know, for those of you who don't know this history, gave one of the most emotional speeches I've ever seen in Russia to the Leningrad City Soviet. He got a lot of attention because of his last name, as you might imagine, in St. Petersburg. And it was this really moving moment where Democrats, small d Democrats from America, were addressing small d Democrats in Russia, hoping for a future. So Zev, hopefully we'll go back and celebrate a new democracy in Russia someday in the future. And Max, before I get going, I also want to say it's a great honor to be here with you. I'm going to turn around some of the questions you asked me to you because we should really just be having a chat. Max really is.
You're on the spot.
No. I'm going to do that when I get to the limits of my knowledge. In all seriousness, Max, I've read your work for decades. You're one of the most important people debating American foreign policy in our country. And especially over the last several years, you have been a really courageous voice to defend democracy, not just around the world, but in our country. And I really am very honored to be here with you today. And I just learned a little bit about your history. I'm going to come back to that later when we are doing our sound check, but maybe we'll get back to that at the end of our conversation. But now let me try to answer your question. Actually, one of the last columns I wrote before the end of the Trump presidency for the Washington Post, I don't write as often as Max does, but I did a scorecard. I'm a professor, right? So I did a scorecard and went around the world and gave grades to the Trump team. And I did both Trump and the Trump administration, because I think sometimes you needed to separate out those two different actors in the world, because they were not always aligned, most certainly not with respect to Russia. And the bottom line up front was that I gave out a lot of D's and F's. I only had one B. I think that was for what they did in the Middle East. And I think I gave a C+ for their policy on China, although I had to give a caveat to that, because I thought what they did with respect to China was pretty good on the diagnostics, not very good on the actual policy prescriptions or the things they did. And we can go through all of those in a minute, but I think the damage was pretty deep. And I don't know how lasting it will be in the following sense. And let me explain what I mean by that. So it was deep because for the first time really, definitely since the end of World War II, and I think you have to go back to the 20s, and now I'm on with the historian, so I'll defer to Max if you have to go deeper. But for the first time in a long, long time, we had a president that fundamentally didn't believe in the utility of engagement with the outside world. He was skeptical of it. You've heard it all. You heard it said America first 10,000 times. And by the way, I want to be clear about this. All presidents think about America first. All foreign policy is about what is good for American security, prosperity, and our values. I worked for Barack Obama for 5 years. That was his mindset. But sometimes it meant doing things on our own. Sometimes it meant engaging in the world. And sometimes it meant coercive stuff. Sometimes it meant cooperative stuff. But Trump was really the first person that just said, I don't want to engage with the world. I want to go my own way. That first and foremost did deep damage to our allies, especially in Europe, but also in Asia. And that is a lingering legacy, because today, because of Zoom, we jump all over the world these days. And, I've been in Europe and Asia in the last 10 days. And there's a lingering notion there that says, hey, wait a minute, maybe Trump was the beginning of a brand new era in America. And that Biden now is just the last hurrah of this old internationalist tradition. And that doubt is lingering. So that is there. And then the second piece, maybe we'll jump around regions later, but the second piece where I think he did deep damage was on the values question. Now, we have a deep, long debate in our country that goes back actually to the beginning of our republic about whether we should promote our values or just our interests. And it's always there. Sometimes, you know, classically in academia, this is the debate between realists and liberals. Max, just so you know, I hate those terms because the idea that I'm going to cede the territory, as somebody who believes that we should be engaged in this, I get cartoonized as being against realist pragmatic policies. So do you, Max. And I hate that language, but that's the kind of language that's there. It is true, however, that we face this debate on a lot of issues. And most certainly I did when working at the White House. Most certainly I did when working out in Moscow. But Trump basically didn't care about that debate. He basically, you know, just gave up on it and said, why do we care about human rights in Russia or really all over the world? Every now and then they gave lip service to places like Iran and Venezuela. And that also has been a jarring moment, I think, around the globe, because people worry, are we now giving up on those sets of things as well? Now, the Biden team, as you know, just as well as I do, have made it very clear that they're one, internationalists, and two, they believe in advocating for democracy and human rights. But I do believe that Trump has left this lingering doubt about maybe this is the beginning of another trajectory. And Max, as you know better than I do even, there are those isolationist tendencies, not just within the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party as well. And that is the damage that I think the new Biden team is trying to clean up.
I'd be curious for your assessment of the early moves in the Biden administration. And this is truly early. I mean, we're talking, you know, less than 2 months in here, but already they've done some fairly significant things, some of them pretty expected, like rejoining the Paris Climate Accord and the WHO, ending the Muslim ban, increasing refugee admissions. There have been a few other things, including ending support for the Saudi war in Yemen, issuing the Jamal Khashoggi report on Saudi complicity in Khashoggi's murder. There's also an escalating standoff with Iran, where a pro-Iranian militia attacked one of our bases in northern Iraq. We bombed a militia base in Syria. And then just today or yesterday, I think we had another attack, a rocket attack on a US base in Iraq. But I would also point out some things that Biden has not done. For example, he has not reversed Trump on moving the US embassy to Jerusalem. He has not lifted tariffs on China or the EU. He has not rejoined the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he hasn't really signaled any new approach in terms of Venezuela. So there's certainly a fair amount of change, but there's also some continuity. And I'm curious for your sense, or just very early on now, too little change, too much? Are they getting the balance about right? What's your take on the early moves?
Well, I think you very eloquently summarized it in terms of what they've done and what they haven't done. You know, my initial reaction is I'm fairly impressed by the things I support. So engagement in some of those multilateral organizations, I think that's right. I like the rhetoric and ambition about democracy and human rights. And at the same time, I would say, you know, one, they're putting us in a holding pattern, especially about China. I would say they keep saying, well, you need to do our review. They haven't yet signaled what they're doing. And particularly, Max, you rightly pointed out, the hardest decision for them is going to be about what to do about Trump's tariffs. And then I would just say on some of the issues about democracy and human rights, I mean, they've been really assaulted, right? And I remember this, by the way, when I worked in the government, you can plan what you want during the campaign, and then you have your transition period and you write all your papers. By the way, they just published one of their transition papers today, a fairly detailed document. For those who haven't seen it, I've just glanced at it. I've been on Zoom calls all day here at Stanford, but I knew it was in the works, and it's more detailed. You know, it's not like a mini national security strategy, right? Which usually comes in the second year of administrations. Pretty detailed document. I would encourage people to look at it. And I'm impressed by that. You know, I think that's a wise thing, by the way. Put out some markers. Tony Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, I have to get used to calling him Secretary of State Blinken. I've known him as Tony for a long time. Also gave a major speech today, right, to echo that national security strategy. And I think that's smart to lay out some parameters of what you seek to do. And you know, there's quite a bit of detail in there, including one theme that they want us to hear. And so let me echo it just in case you haven't seen these documents, you know, about the connectivity in their view between the Biden foreign policy and domestic policy here in the United States, a foreign policy for the middle class, as Biden as a candidate said. Secretary Blinken outlined some of that. What I would say, you know, three things I would say TBD. Well, two things TBD and one part that I'm disappointed in. TBD is on China. I don't think it's clear what they're going to do there. You know, they've signaled they're going to compete and engage, but the devil's in the details of that. What is the mix of those things? And they say they're still reviewing. Second, I would say, and I say this with bitter experience in my time in the government, it's a lot easier to outline the ambitions of your policy than it is to outline strategies for achieving them. And they have laid out a lot of ambition, a lot of goals, and it's TBD to see how well they do in terms of defining policies that achieve those objectives. You know, one of my, I was a huge fan of President Obama. I loved working for him. I think we had a lot of achievements. We had some failures as well. I'm happy to discuss them if you want. But I think one thing we spent too much time on is, including me, I spent a lot of time helping to write fantastic speeches. I think President Obama gave some of the best speeches in foreign policy ever. In Cairo, in Moscow, you probably didn't catch that one, in Accra, at the UN. These were great speeches. And Ben Rhodes, as principal speechwriter, you know, these were great speeches in South Africa, lots of great speeches. Where we fell short was in the implementation strategies, and that's what needs to come next. And then on my, you know, disappointment, and I'm just, you know, this is my view, and I know how difficult it is to thread these needles. But I thought what they tried to do with respect to Khashoggi, you know, I just think they just missed it a little bit. So I applaud that they released that ODNI report that I think makes very clear that the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, was the person that killed our colleague. I mean, he was a former Washington Post columnist, just so everybody knows. And I knew Jamal. We used to do projects with him here at Stanford. That's good. Transparency and the facts is important. I thought they pulled their punches by sanctioning, you know, 75 individuals, but they didn't name them. And that was a choice they made, right? They could have used the Global Magnitsky Act to name those people, and they decided to use a different mechanism. I would have liked to seen them have been named, and I would have liked them to do slightly more with the Crown Prince. I mean, you can't call somebody a murderer and then have no response to him. Even just calling out his name by senior officials, I would have liked to see them do that. I understand the difficulties. He's the future head of state. They have to deal with them, but I just would have slightly moved the needle differently there. And then second in the same category, they just announced new sanctions with respect to Mr. Navalny, the opposition leader who was poisoned last summer, went to Germany to recover, and then courageously returned to Moscow, was immediately arrested and sentenced unjustly to a 2.5-year prison term in a penal colony, one of the worst penal colonies in all of Russia. They rightly sanctioned a group of people that were connected to that, and they sanctioned some very senior people in the Kremlin. That impressed me. That was important. Navalny's team wanted them to sanction the oligarchs that support the Putin regime. They're the ones, after all, that have their money in New York and LA and Paris and London, and they chose not to do so. So I would have moved the needle slightly that way. But Max, I think this is the space where, it's going to be hard because they've said unequivocally, and I support them 100%, that they're going to be different from the Trump team and they're going to deal with these issues. And immediately on day one, they were handed, their incoming in their inbox was Belarus. Well, that's a lingering, but that's there. And the Belarusians want them to do more. That Navalny, I think Navalny might have timed his trip to be right as the Biden people showed up. I don't know that for sure, but okay, now they're handed that. The coup in Myanmar just happened. The opposition leader in Georgia just happened on their watch. And so the challenge of being true to your values, they have a lot of very, difficult sets of issues. And then I already mentioned Saudi Arabia, that's all happened just in a period of 5 weeks. That's pretty hard to do. And I would just remind everybody, they are dealing with this incoming with one person, Secretary Blinken over at the State Department. Everybody else, well, that's not true. They've named some lower level officials, but their deputy secretary, their undersecretary, none of their assistant secretaries have been appointed yet. That's a lot to do in just 5 weeks.
Well, there's a lot of particular issues I want to dig into, but let me just ask another kind of broad brush question, which is, it's pretty obvious the ways in which the Biden foreign policy differs from Trump, but does it also differ from Obama? What's the difference between the administration you served in? This is obviously not the third Obama term, so what's the difference?
It's a great question. And I would say, I don't know yet, but I think there's a couple of aspirational differences. And that's, aspiration is not policy. You don't get credit for trying in diplomacy. Let me tell you from bitter experience, you get credit for outcomes. You get credit for what the State Department calls deliverables. You get credit for things that make American people safer, better off, and true to their values, not statements that you release from the White House. And aspirationally, I see a couple of things that are different. And a couple of continuities that I think are good too. So let me both those categories. So aspirationally, they have told us that they want a foreign policy that serves the American people, and they've even identified a particular group of American people. They've labeled them the middle class. They say, and including in Secretary Blinken's speech today, that they very subtly hinted that maybe our trade policies and TPP in particular didn't go far enough to serving the interests of the middle class. And I think that's great. I think that's right. The devil will be in the details of what are you actually doing that advances that. Particularly that term of middle class is very elastic. I don't mean to put my social science, political science hat on here, but when you really dig into it, not exactly clear what they mean.
Hopefully that's not just code word for protectionism.
Well, that's you said it more bluntly than I was, Max. Exactly. And let's not forget that the middle class has also benefited from trade. I'm looking at all the devices around my house and all the devices, produced abroad. So it's a complicated question. I get nervous when, we were just talking about oversimplifying these things. So that's the first thing, but that's different. That's different. And you mentioned TPP already, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I would say I supported TPP for a lot of reasons, even when I got out of the government. And I was in the government when the original negotiations were happening. I thought it was a very smart policy. I do not think the Obama administration did a very good job of explaining what TPP was. I hosted Mike Froman out here at Stanford one day. He was the head of USTR at the time, and Mike was the leading negotiator for TPP. And they should have stopped, they should have said, this is it serves the middle class, it protects the environment, it protects his intellectual property, because actually a lot of the components of TPP did just that. By the way, a lot of the components of TPP were incorporated by the Trump administration in their renegotiations with our friends in Canada and Mexico, but we didn't sell it that way, and but they've now said we're going to be different in that category. They're not. I don't think they're going to try to resurrect TPP. And that's a mistake on my part, my view, because geopolitically, I think it was also incredibly important to build the coalition of countries in Asia against the coalition that the Chinese are trying to build. So I think that's a mistake, but I don't think they're going back to it. But the other piece is on the democracy and human rights piece. We tried to thread the needle. I obviously was a part of it. In speeches and in policies. President Obama was on this call with us today. He would remind everybody about the things that we did to promote democracy in the world. And I'm proud of that legacy. I think we did. The Biden team has placed more emphasis on those issues. And I think they're consciously trying to do that. And I applaud that. But I think they're trying to say, we're different. We're on this debate between realists and liberals. We lean more heavily here. They're going to do it differently. They're going to do it with allies. They're going to techno-democracy alliances and all that. But they're putting more emphasis on that. That's different than the way we talked about things. 3, China, of course. The rhetoric is different. Whether the policies will be, that's another matter. But I think this compete and engage language, that we're going to do both at the same time, is different from the early Obama years. Again, I think Obama's team had that in the later years, and at the WTO, they did a lot of good work there, and looked to punish China, but they were careful in their rhetoric. So was the vice president, by the way, when he was quoting Mr. Xi back then. He uses different language now. We'll see if the policy changes so much with that. And then in continuities, I would say I'm glad that they have reinvigorated their commitment to allies. I think that's right. And that was, again, the rhetoric of the Trump era was horrible, if actually the policies were not so bad. Here, I think the rhetoric is right, and I hope the policies will continue in that direction.
Well, since we have with us one of the world's preeminent experts on Russia, I feel compelled to ask you to dig in a little bit more into what's happening in that country.
Sure.
And you kind of got my attention earlier by suggesting that you have some hopes for Russian democracy, which certainly separates you, I think, from most people, but you never know. I mean, certainly I grew up in the 80s, so I never expected that the Berlin Wall would come down or the Soviet Union could collapse. So you never know. Right. But do you think that the Putin system is more fragile than it appears? Do you think there's a reason why he seems to be so scared of Navalny, even though there's no real possibility right now that Navalny could possibly overthrow Putin, but Putin is going to a lot of lengths and taking a lot of damage internationally in his international standing to try to kill and imprison Navalny. So why is he worried about this one guy who supposedly people have said doesn't have much appeal outside of a few major Europeanized cities in Russia? Yeah.
So let me break it down in kind of short term, long term, right? Because in the short term, I'm actually quite pessimistic. I am not in the camp that thinks the Putin regime is going to collapse anytime soon, because it's actually a fairly sophisticated autocracy that has a money stream from oil and gas that will not be interrupted if they lose the support of the middle class, right? They don't depend on taxation as a way to stay in power. And there's a long, big academic literature that talks about why those kind of rentier states or those oil dependent states have ways to survive longer than those others. So let me say that first. And this may sound a bit contradictory, but it's a complex story. Having said that, I'm also struck by the waning popularity of Putin and obvious actions that Putin are taking, as you just rightly pointed out, Max, that suggest he's paranoid about his ability to stay in power inside Russia. You're right. There's no reason to arrest Navalny. In many ways, he's created more attention for Mr. Navalny by doing that. And yet their own analysis has decided, this started when I was the ambassador to Russia back in 2012, when he first came back as president for his third term. And back then, to remind everybody, that's when we had this explosion of popular activism against the Putin regime, right? There was a falsified election in December 2011, kind of falsified under normal 5, 6, 7%. I remember us sitting in the White House thinking, this is no big deal. This is Russia. This is the way they always do it. But this time around, partly because of the middle class, they call it the creative class, partly because of smartphones, partly because Twitter, Facebook, Vkontakte allowed them to spin this evidence of falsification around. You did have these massive demonstrations, at one point peaking at 200,000, right? On the streets of Moscow and other big cities. And remember, the last time you had 200,000 people on the streets of Moscow was 1991, the year the Soviet Union did collapse. And there's no question in my mind that Putin freaked out about that and thought that this was a real threat. And that's when he pivoted hard against us and decided that he had to make the West, Obama, Secretary Clinton, and me personally, the new enemy of Russia. And they did that to great effect in terms of their propaganda and as a way to marginalize people like Navalny, people like Boris Nemtsov that they later killed in 2016 because they were the leaders of the opposition, right? And I thought that after they had done that, they'd kind of figured out how to, tamp this down. And then the punctuation mark to that was when Putin annexed Crimea. That was very popular in Russia. And that's when his approval rating shot up to 80%. And it seemed like everything was fine. Fast forward to today, the sugar buzz that they got from that, that war that was very popular because it's related to the legacy that, the propaganda that Crimea was unjustly handed over to Ukraine under Khrushchev, and that was very popular, but it's faded now. That was 7 years ago, and in Russia they call it the battle between the TV and the battle between the refrigerator. On TV, they're bombarded with, aren't we great? And we're doing, everything's fine. And then you open the refrigerator and, you're not seeing things there that you want to see. And sanctions have had an effect, but the economy has been petering along for the last 7 years. And so therefore has Putin's approval rating. And one more dimension I want to add to this, because this comes up frequently when I talk about Russia. I want to remind everybody tuning in that you need to take with a grain of salt public opinion polls that you see conducted in Russia with some, with just some parameters to remember that we do not have good ways, very effective social science ways to poll people in dictatorships. This is true in Iran, it's true in China, it's true in Russia. It's really true in places like North Korea. Many of my colleagues here at Stanford try to do these things. And here's why. Everybody knows that your phone is listened to. Everybody is well aware of that. And so when some stranger from Moscow calls you up in Vladivostok and says, hey, Natasha, my name's Volodya from Moscow. I work for a polling firm and I just want to know what you think of Putin. There's really only one rational response to that question, okay? I mean, there's no incentive to reveal your actual preferences. There's some pretty interesting social science techniques to get around that, but I would just remember that. And yet, despite that, his numbers are falling. And then you have got people like Navalny, who has become popular in Russia, first and foremost, because he's exposing corruption. Navalny, more than anything, is just an anti-corruption actor. So successful, by the way, that some people think that the regime sometimes uses him against their enemies. I think that's propaganda, but he's extremely successful at exposing really over-the-top corruption. And right before he flew back to Moscow, he released this new video called Putin's Palace. Last time I checked, it was over 120 million views on YouTube that exposed this incredibly over-the-top palace that Putin and his cronies are building. And, you know, he therefore has decided that he needs to crack down even more. Navalny is the most prominent one, but on many, many more actors throughout Russia. That sounds like paranoia to me. And, you know, I would just say two things in closing on this. Obviously, you can see I get very animated when we talk about Russia and its future, but I want to talk about, end with the optimistic point, but 2 points in the short run. Whenever regimes increase coercion, that usually is when they begin to crumble. And that's, we've known this for hundreds of years of history, right? That I don't think there's going to be another breath of fresh air or renewal for Putinism and the Putin regime. This is a sign of decay of that regime, not a sign of renewal. And the second thing I'd say, and I got in trouble for saying this a few weeks ago, so I apologize to the Obama fans here. I'm about as big of an Obama fan as you get. I love the guy. But if President Obama was in his 21st year of serving as the United States president, I think I might even be getting sick of him, right? I mean, think about how long 21 years is. For all these young people in Russia, I was just speaking to some Russians earlier today, he's been in power their entire lives. And for, you know, college kids, at least their entire lives, for being politically aware, that suggests that people are tired of him, including, by the way, a lot of elites that benefit from the regime. So I think the regime is fading without knowing when it'll collapse entirely.
Let's take some questions. I have more that I could ask myself, but I want to get the audience involved here. You know, we have one question all the way from Melbourne, showing the reach of this program, saying here in the Pacific, we are fearful of the impact of China's policies in the region. Do you think sanctions against China will impact its aggressive policies vis-a-vis its neighbors? There's another question on a similar issue relating to Hong Kong, but I would also broaden it out beyond China, just to say we sanction an awful lot of people. It's kind of what we do. It often seems like either that or drone strikes. Basically, those are like the two things we can actually do that have an immediate impact. But is there kind of a limit to how much we can do with sanctions, especially on a massive country like China, whose economy is soon going to be bigger than ours?
Yes, exactly, Max. Thank you for underscoring that, because we have sanctions has been, you know, let's go to sanctions because we don't know what else to do. And by the way, when we say sanctions, there is a wide distribution within the label of let's sanction Russia, or Iran, or China. I remember this, you know, I worked in the Obama administration during our buildup of sanctions against Iran, which I thought were extremely effective and a necessary predicate for the Iran nuclear deal. But we have come nowhere close to what we did vis-a-vis Iran with either Russia or China, and we never will be. And two, there is this correlation that you suggested. Sanctions worked best against the smaller the country is and more dependent it is on the United States, the more ability we have to influence what happens in those countries, right? But conversely, the larger those countries are and the less connectivity we have, the less effective sanctions are. And that's an axiom from the literature, but I think it's important, especially when thinking about Russia and China. And I do think, you know, with respect to China, we need a multi-pronged, you know, grand strategy of containment and engagement. You know, both. I do think this is I'm trying to get the right verb here because I know people get nervous about containment, but I do think it is a policy of containment. But I will remind people And I've written about this. There are parallels to the Cold War, and there are things that have nothing to do with the Cold War, in my view, with respect to China. But I do think we should study the Cold War, to learn about some of the things we did right. And I do think we did some very good things in the Cold War, by the way, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, but also to study some things that we did disastrously wrong so that they don't repeat them. So we don't repeat them vis-a-vis China. So in the category of smart things, I think we took ideology and information very seriously during the Cold War, and we developed some tools, including Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, that were very useful, and connectivity to societies, closed societies that had unintended positive consequences later down the road. We should learn from those experiences. I think we did containment generally pretty smartly. And then on the other side of the ledger, we went too far. We at moments in our history, we decided we had to go towards global containment. And Max, I'm not going to talk about Vietnam because you know a whole lot more about Vietnam than I would. I would. Let me throw this around. Tell me what you think about this debate about global containment. I would really be interested in what you think about it. I'm wrestling with it right now in what I'm writing. My view tends to be, I was just, full disclosure, I was just reading Kennan about 2 hours ago on this debate and what he thought about these things. But with respect to China,
as you know from reading Gaddis's book, of course, Kennan completely changed his mind about containment over the course of his own life, going from a very much a military-oriented containment to much more anti-military, much more just trying to compete with the Soviets in terms of having a better society.
Right, he did. And as you know better than I, there was a huge debate back, 46, 47, 48 about global versus not. And on that debate, he was for a much more moderate strategy. And I'll let you answer if you want, because you know a lot about this history. I don't. But Korea was right. Vietnam, it seems to me, maybe we reached too far. And most certainly the part of the world I know better, because I wrote my PhD about it, Southern Africa, there was no reason that we needed to arm Jonas Savimbi to try to defeat communism in Angola to win the Cold War. I think that was a huge mistake. I think aligning with the apartheid regime in South Africa, because we thought we needed that to contain the Soviets. I think, and this is not revisionist history, just so everybody knows, I wrote this in the mid 80s. But I think those are important lessons for how we think about China, because on the one hand, I believe very strongly that we need a sophisticated strategy of containment and to make sure where the red lines are, particularly with respect to borders, as we had to do during the Cold War, and even ambiguous borders, like in Berlin and Germany, where we had to be clear of our commitments. At the same time, I'm not so sure we're going to win that struggle if we decide, for instance, as the Trump administration said, that, well, let me just make it more broadly, because the Biden folks are looking at it too, that we have to stop every BRI project in every corner of the world, Belt and Road Initiative, or we have to bribe the Guatemalans to not do BRI and use American taxpayers to pay back the Chinese so that they don't do a BRI project. That's exactly the kind of games we played in Africa with the Soviets, where governments learned how to play us off each other. That didn't lead to developments and led to a lot of bad investments. And I just think that we have to be smart about that as we think about how to deal with China moving forward. And I'm sorry to go on about it, but we also got to get smart about this ideological part of it. I just think, we got out of the habit, not you, Max, but many Americans got out of the habit of thinking about the differences between autocracies and democracies, liberalism versus illiberalism. And most certainly going back to my time with Zev, we thought we won the Cold War, and so we didn't have to engage in these ideological things. And that was a mistake. We should have invested in political science departments throughout the post-communist world to teach courses on liberalism. And instead we thought, well, it's over. Everybody's going to join us. And we now know that was wrong. And I just think it doesn't mean we go back to the same playbook, but I think we have to think a lot more systematically about the ideas part of how we deal with autocratic countries like China, Russia, and Iran.
Well, let me pick up on that because I noticed Tony Blinken's speech today. He talks about that need to put democracy, defending democracy first and foremost, among the top priorities in U.S. foreign policy, while at the same time saying we're not going to engage in wars of regime change. But kind of the middle ground, which the Eisenhower administration often went for, because they didn't want to become involved in more wars like Korea. But so that often meant covert action, and in particular, trying to undermine communist regimes from within through various methods, everything from smuggling out samizdat from the Soviet Union to sponsoring coups and all sorts of crazy covert operations. But should we be doing more covertly to try to undermine the regimes in Moscow and Beijing, and trying to, should we actually make it a goal of US policy to help Russian and Chinese Democrats to overthrow their governments? Is that something we should be doing?
I don't think so. Although I'm hesitating because I've thought about where I would draw the lines. Again, as you know better than I, we had those policies, and sometimes those policies had some good effects, and sometimes, country I know well, a case I know well, Hungary 1956, during the Eisenhower years, we did a lot of signaling that we want you to overthrow the regime, and then people took actions, and then they were slaughtered, and we did not defend them. And so I get very nervous about making commitments that we're not willing to follow through on. And, I'm a veteran of, the red lines debates in the Obama administration. One of my colleagues who just passed away recently here, George Shultz, he's been a big mentor. He was an incredible mentor to me from a very early age. Still when I was at Oxford, I got to know George. By the way, when we were debating about constructive engagement with South Africa and Angola, because he just left the government at the time, and the Reagan doctrine, and one of George's very famous things that he used to say, by the end of his life, he almost said at virtually every meeting he was in, he was a Marine, and he would always tell the story that when he was first given his gun, the sergeant told him, never point that gun unless you're willing to shoot. And it was always his way of talking about, false promises that you're not willing to follow through on are worse than not picking up the gun and pointing it in the first place. The second thing I would say on the covert side, obviously I'm not privy to what we can and cannot do anymore. I used to be read into all of that, just so we're clear. But I haven't read those kind of things since 2014. I just think up until you get to covert stuff, there are so many other things in the 21st century that can be used today before you have to go over the line to covert because of new technology and the way people are connected. And I just think we're underutilizing that space. And I mean it in the kind of information space. I mean it in the education space, right? So that I think is a undervalued, understudied space, and the government, we just don't do a good job with it right now. Our radios are in disarray, of the politicization of what happened there in the Trump administration just left an incredible mess. My view is that they should all be spun off. We should not have a US AMG. I don't want to get into the weeds, but we have this government entity where the Voice of America is, and Radio Free Asia and Radio Farda. I think it's a complete mess. And we should just set up a bunch of independent foundations and have it directly funded by the Congress, kind of like the National Endowment for Democracy is, and go back to the model of Radio Free Europe, where we had people much closer to the action and not people there, and then blow up VOA. I just think we've VOA needs radically restructured. It has a mission statement that doesn't make any sense. On the one hand, they want to be a news agency, and on the other hand, it says right in their charter they're supposed to be, explaining American policy and explaining America. You can't do those things at the same time. So to me, there's a lot of reform in that space. And then finally, there's people like me and places like Stanford have a lot more to contribute in this space because of technology. I literally was just talking to activists, small d activists in Europe about this morning, about how we can, using technology, including just like the one we're now doing, build new networks of small d Democrats and even just students of democracy throughout the world as a way to help those societies when they're isolated. And the last thing I'll say on this front, Max, because my friend Boris Nemtsov always said it, and I always feel compelled to say it. He had a meeting with President Obama when we flew to Moscow in July 2009 with a group of other opposition leaders. By the way, something people forget, but presidents, when they travel abroad, should meet with opposition leaders. President Trump never did that. Obama did. And lots of people in the room were saying things that Obama should do to help them. And Nemtsov said, and he was this incredibly charismatic leader for those of you who've never seen him, and made a big impression on Obama in just a short period of time. He said, "Hey, President Obama, I don't want your help. We're going to take care of our fate. I'm a proud patriot of Russia. I don't want any help from you and your government. I just want you to stop helping the autocrats in the world. That's what you need to do. Stop helping those that are suppressing us."
We have about 3 minutes, and I'll toss out one final question that's a personal one to you, maybe for a fast answer. And the question is, what was it like when you found out that Putin wanted you to be sent by Trump to Moscow for interrogation? Kind of a backhanded tribute.
This is the last question, right, Max? I'm going to try to weave a couple of things together then. It wasn't a great feeling. Because I work for NBC, I was actually in Helsinki on TV live when that conversation happened in that press conference. And, I said at the time, I said live TV, that's our job, right, Max, to do color commentary as things are happening in real time. I've watched you do it hundreds of times. I said, I was on with Lester Holt, right? And I was like, "Oh, this is ridiculous." The conversation, just so you know, initially it was not about me personally. It was about, we had just indicted, Mr. Mueller had just indicted 11 or a dozen GRU, Russian military intelligence officials. And Putin obviously had said to Trump in their one-on-one meeting, "Well, I'll hand them over for your interrogation to your people if you let us interrogate a dozen Americans." And on the press conference, Trump said, "Well, that's a great idea. I think that's fair enough." And I said on TV, I said, obviously, Trump has no idea what he's talking about. Our government would never do that. And then I said, by the way, this is a good reason why he should have his advisors in the room. At the time, it was a friend of mine. Fiona Hill was his chief Russia advisor, but she wasn't in the room. And I said, this is a good reason why you should have these people there, so you don't, chew on these really crazy ideas. And then on the flight home, Max, I was on the internet, which I usually am not, by the way, flying, but I decided to, and I started getting bombarded by Russian journalists, because that's when they announced, the prosecutor general in Russia had announced that I was on this list. And it was actually a lot worse, just so you know. He was suggesting that I had been indicted for a crime that I had committed against Russia. By the way, not while I was the ambassador, but while I was working at the National Security Council, coordinating, and this is true, coordinating Obama's reaction to the killing of Mr. Magnitsky. And I did that. And we actually sanctioned a dozen Russians before the Magnitsky Act ever was passed. And their intelligence was right. I was the coordinator of that. And then I thought, okay, the stakes have gotten a little higher here. Being accused of a crime by Mr. Putin, that's a scary thing. especially because they do abuse Interpol in ways, and I have to worry about that ever since. And then I thought, but surely the Trump team will bat this away, and then they didn't. You know, at the White House, they said on Monday, we're looking into this idea. And that's when I mobilized people. And by the end of the week, by the way, 98-0, the US Senate passed a resolution saying this is crazy and that should never happen. And that's a long story, but I want to end on a good news story. Two really great things happened related to that event. One, American society actually did mobilize. I just mentioned the Congress, but people on Twitter, on TV, NGOs, there was a hashtag Protect McFaul happening. And it reminded me about the virtues of our democratic process. And, you know, thankfully, we're not ruled by a king, and Trump just couldn't declare, you know, to hand me over. And that was a great moment, even at a very scary time for my family, especially that, you know, he can't do that. We have laws here and we have people to mobilize. And for a time there, Max, you know, people were coming up to me on the street and in airports, you know, saying, you know, we got your back, Mike. And it was actually a pretty invigorating time about democracy. But it also reminded me of something else. I know we've gone over, but I want to tell this story because it's important to me. It also reminded me, you know, why does Putin hate me so much? Putin hates me because I stood up for democratic activists when I was ambassador, and I still do to this day. That's why he hates me. That's why they run all these propaganda things against me, you know, in that same category. And it reminded me, and somebody told me that, like, you know, don't forget the reason he's harassing you, Mike, is he's afraid of you. He wants you to shut up. He's intimidating you. Don't play that. Now, thankfully, I have Stanford University to help defend me and my freedom of speech. But I remember that this was a campaign about autocrats and Democrats, not just about me and Trump and Putin. And Max, here's something I learned, which I didn't know, and we'll end on this, that your family was a Jewish refusnik family in Moscow. Is that true?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So our sponsors tonight told me this when we did the sound check the other day. I want you to know that my first moment of political activism of anything meaningful happened in the summer of 1983 in Leningrad. I was an exchange student, my first time abroad studying Russian. I'd never been, think about that, folks. I'd never been abroad, and I went to the evil empire as my first trip abroad. Imagine what my mom in Montana thought about that. She thought California was a communist country. Now her son's going off to the evil empire. Anyway, I went, and it was important for me. You know, I wanted to see communism, and I wanted to see if these places were as awful as they were. I was kind of socialist leaning back then, I'll tell you honestly. Moved away from that after getting to know the place pretty well later. But as you'll recall, and I'll bet you a lot of listeners of this call will remember, back in those days, it was hard to communicate with refusnik families. And so they would use people like us students to deliver messages. And one of my friends, I was just tagging along. I was not part of this world. She was a friend of mine on this exchange program. And we went one day, and she was delivering a letter that I think, I can't remember exactly, but as I remember it, was a letter of acceptance to a family, to a high school student in Leningrad, to the London School of Economics, that because, you know, they were blocking, they were not allowed, you know, he never got that letter, but we were delivering that letter, even though we knew that the chances of him being able to use it and be accepted to the LSE was very low, but we were doing it. And I remember we were sitting on a bench right off Nevsky Prospect, and I'm just tagging along, and my friend hands a letter. His mother starts to cry, gives this big hug to my colleague and my big hug to me. And it was, thank you for not forgetting our fight. We're still, you know, this is 1983. This is not a great time in the Soviet Union. And as we walked away from that event, that's when I really, for the rest of my life, in one shape or form or another, I have thought about fighting for the people, fighting for the right to have, you know, basic human rights and dignity. It was a very meaningful moment in my life. And I just learned the other day that Max was one of those families. So I just wanted to say that. And remember, small d Democrats throughout the world, folks, I have the honor and privilege to interact with them all the time. They're still out there fighting every day, and they want that solidarity. They even if we can't help them, small acts of solidarity mean a tremendous amount. If your father just got sent to prison in Russia, or your friends just got beat up in Belarus, or your family members are now arrested in Hong Kong, it means a lot to those people.
Well, I'm very grateful for what you did, and very grateful for what so many of the folks who are organizers of this group, like Zev and Mel and so many others, did in the fight for Soviet Jewry in the 1970s, because I wouldn't be here if that weren't the case. And that's one reason why I really believe in the importance of promoting human rights and democracy in US foreign policy, because I've seen the benefits myself, but I know that there's so many others who have benefited from that being championed by America. So on that note, let me unfortunately bring this conversation to a close. So I feel like we could go on for hours, and there's a lot more to be said, but it was a great conversation, great insights. And I think we all learned a lot. I would note for everybody that the next event is going to be upcoming on March 10th, Combating America's Domestic Extremists, with RAND's Brian Jenkins and Javad Ali. So please tune in at that time. Thanks for having me back. And it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. That was really fun. Real honor to be on with you tonight. Bye-bye.